panel, in today's society, the rise of the internet literally put content that was essentially impossible to even seen became so mainstream that it literally takes only 2 clicks and you've seen more than probably a king from 200 years ago. This becomes particularly important insofar as there's a need to become an inherent way of regulation and maintenance of sexuality. And we see that repression isn't going to be the solution for that. But from the start, it should be about knowledge and control that will happen when you have open discussion. To harness this innate human trait to be your benefactor instead of your opponent. Essential points that we need to keep for a better debate. This is a value judgment debate that we tailor to benefit the LGBTQ community as a whole. Sexual repression, when left in a vacuum, grows to something that becomes inherently uncontrollable, i.e. you get more fantasies, self-destructive desires, that ultimately happens to the side that does not have a system for sustainable communication discussion. When these things are actively supported, we are able to reduce stigmatization, how open discussion that is free of judgment ultimately leads to more growth in terms of sexual identity and thought. The world is already hypersexualized even outside of just the LGBTQ community. Let them know from the start so that we can inherently control their sexuality and tendencies. We avoid infringing on the people on the further parts of the spectrum and be able to help them receive some form of catharsis and be able to actually represent themselves out there in the community. Being sexual exists on both sides. However, what is the core of the contention is that we are able to make a more cohesive world that dominance causes the change that we want. So 3 things that I will do in my speech: rebuttal to the immediate previous speaker, 2 central topics that is relevant to this debate, and ultimately how we outweigh government in the clashes that we went through. So, going into my rebuttals, side government tries to have their cake and eat it too. All of their benefits only come to fruition because we accepted the dominance of hypersexualization. We agree to that nuance, that dominance. The reason why it's so powerful is because it's dominant and people get offended. On both sides, people will get offended. On our side, at the very least, these do not come at the expense of the people feeling like they are less and do not form a part of legitimate sexual discourse. Gov sides runs a very negative case and gives us no counterfactual as to how these people on the far end of the spectrum will feel more safe and more included. Because on side government, the opposite literally happens and these people become a seesaw effect of harms. On our side, we have the plurality of views and identities, even if the moderates on the fence might get offended. The trade-off is the majority of people that are better able to sexually identify when it's not considered taboo anymore. Government side intuition pumps this idea of voyeurism, coercion, and use of force. Look, our burden isn't to defend these people, a worldwide urge that they accuse us of. In fact, shattering the veil of apathy that exists on their side and ignorance happens on our side when we have the plurality of ideologies that allows people to have a better discourse and make their own choices. So 2 central themes that I think are very relevant to this topic: sexuality as a natural part of human nature, and how ultimately we have open discussion that leads to growth of the community. So the first contention relating to the natural part of human nature: vulnerability of the uninvolved, i.e. demi-romantic asexuals, those who are in the fence, closeted, and just trying to find their way out there. This argument is not necessarily true for the central reason that the movement is for everyone. Those in the farthest part of the spectrum that are oppressed and underrepresented, repressed and underrepresented. We say that it is the nuance of open discussion that primarily happens more in our side because you're able to discuss it with your friends instead of people like, priests. It is when you're desensitized that you ultimately challenge the lens of sexuality. We ultimately say that this becomes an avenue of representation, an avenue of understanding, and ultimately where we are able to have more cohesion when we are actually able to have proper discussions of these feelings that we are having. Then secondly, the contention of how this slows down the development of the movement. A primary issue that exists in this topic is that which side will truly be able to augment the movement to actually flesh out and develop their ideas. But we primarily say that it's literally when you have an open discussion, it becomes easier for these people to actually express themselves. It helps our most vulnerable stakeholders, those who are sexually repressed and are unable to represent themselves. We say that even if in the short term, that backlash will exist, which happens already on both sides, it will definitely happen. We say that the backlash is going to be symmetrical, but what particularly turns the tide for our side to be better is that the proportionality and capacity of actual real discussions we get in our side, as opposed to the inherently biased discussions that comes from sugar-coated conversations that truly don't develop and understand your sexuality and self-actualization that happens when you repress this form of representation. Another contention of how dominant versus passive hypersexuality. We reject the false dichotomy of how they only see the movement as sexualized as a whole. On both sides, people will have their own kinks and form of sexual expressions. Some people are more sexual, some are less sexual. Again, these are all legitimate parts of the LGBTQ community. It is not a single monolith. We do not generalize. We say that even when taking this soft stance that, we acknowledge hypersexuality, the true extent of magnitude, the benefits that we ultimately have comes in the side which is ultimately represented when you have more people to support it, when it's well known and actually talked about. What comes with discussion will ultimately come acceptance in the long term. Central topic B, how this leads to the growth of the community. Coming from the contention of how this leads to a monolithic image for everyone bisexual. We say ultimately that Gov gave this very cookie-cutter framework of how the LGBT community works when it literally has so many archetypes and representations. We say that the side of realism in this debate, these conversations so exist in a vacuum. It is only in our side where the overly heterosexualization representation primarily happens because you choose to put a lens on only one perspective. Government primarily only hyper-focuses on one side of the LGBTQ community, but primarily forgets the nuance of how diverse and big it is. Why does this particularly become important? Because it removes assertions that Gov tries to assert of, if you don't comply with XYZ, you aren't gay enough. It just furthermore builds our case. It is precisely when it dominates the topic and becomes a cohesive enough room to actually talk, when this thus ultimately settles, the value proposition that we bring an understanding of control truly happens more on our side. With all of those and many more, very proud to oppose.